real-life horror stories at Christmastime. At the time, I was residing in Upper Canada in a spacious cabin-style property. My favorite time of year has always been the holidays, since my family and I would get together to celebrate Christmas at one of our houses. This was something to constantly look forward to, living alone. While I didn't hate being by myself, it was occasionally good to visit friends and family. Our tiny family, who lived in a somewhat large home, would often take turns hosting gatherings at my brother's or my place every year. It was my turn to throw the family reunion this year. However, the majority of my relatives lives on the opposite side of Canada, so it required a long drive or an expensive plane ticket. But on Christmas Eve, everyone usually makes an effort to show up. So, on December 23, I gave my brother a call to make sure things was proceeding according to schedule. He told me that he was driving and should arrive by Christmas Eve night, but our parents might arrive early because of a delayed flight. I bid him farewell and headed back to bed, wishing him safe travels. Now, if you've ever lived in Canada, especially further north, you know the winters are brutally cold and long. Often snowstorms and blizzards can form suddenly and last for varied amounts of time. That being said, the next day, heavy snowfall covered the grounds in the morning and was accompanied by rushing winds in the afternoon. I received a call from my brother around 6 p.m., notifying me that he was going to have to stay at a motel for the night due to the snowstorm covering the roads. I agreed that it was the safe decision, though I was a bit upset that I'd have to spend the day before Christmas alone. But I tried to stay positive, looking forward to Christmas Day with my whole family. At 9 o'clock, I got ready for bed and set an early alarm for 4 a.m., just in case my parents arrived at the airport early. The wind howling outside the house gave me trouble falling asleep, as it was shaking the whole room and making the whole house creak. But as I laid there annoyed and awake, a soft and rhythmic sound approached from outside the cabin. The wind blowing in all directions at random speeds made the soft 1-2 of the footsteps stand out. They were slow, as you would expect in this kind of weather, but they continued all the way until they reached the wall on the left side of my house. I just laid there with my eyes open, listening to this strange person walking during a blizzard in the middle of the night. A lot of things ran through my head, such as complete confusion and fear of a possible attack. However, I began wondering if it was my brother. Maybe something had happened, and his phone didn't have service. Maybe he couldn't find a hotel. The more I had these thoughts, the more I felt I had to find a way to see who it was. In weather like this, nobody could last more than an hour without serious consequences, and I definitely didn't want my brother and his family stuck out there. As I was putting on some heavier clothes, a knock came from downstairs. The odd thing about it was that it was a single knock, and it didn't come from the front door. Hesitantly, I opened my bedroom door and peeked down the stairs. It was far too dark to see anything, but I didn't want to give away my position if it was someone dangerous, so I left the lights off. I walked blindly down the stairs, still listening for any footsteps or sound, but heard nothing aside from the strong winds. As I got to the bottom, I made my way to the front door. While the knock didn't seem to come from the front, I didn't really know what else to do. I'm not sure why, but this was when I really started to get nervous, afraid even. I don't usually say I scare easy, but something just felt very wrong. Approaching the door in silence, I leaned forward and moved the small blinds on the side of the window. A man stood there, looking at the door, looking calm and emotionless. But as soon as he noticed me, he began screaming for me to help him, banging on the window as he stared me in the eyes. I jumped back, not expecting such a sudden reaction. My heart started pounding in my chest. The man didn't look well, as in, he looked crazy, and he had one hand in his pocket like he was hiding something. I didn't feel at all comfortable opening the door, but I also didn't want to have the man's blood on my hands for not helping him during a storm like this. "What's wrong? How did you get here?" I yelled. A few-second pause followed before the man answered calmly, "I got lost. I just need somewhere to shelter." His shift in attitude was alarming. I stood there thinking for a bit before the man asked me again to let him in. Then again and again, getting more aggressive with each word before beginning to hit the door, pounding on it over and over. I ran to the other room to grab my pistol that I kept in cases of home defense. Then I went back to the front door, though I stood a good distance away and held my ground, hoping he would just leave if I ignored him. He continued banging for well over a minute, but as I stood there anxiously waiting, I heard again the crunch of footsteps walking around my house. Knowing now that this was for sure a bad situation, I ran upstairs and locked myself in my bedroom. I heard two men start talking soon after, followed by a window shattering and footsteps entering my home. The footsteps scattered around downstairs. I heard things moving and objects clattering before someone began climbing the stairs. My bedroom was the only room upstairs, aside from a half bathroom and closet. Shaking uncontrollably and praying in my head, I held my gun up and aimed at the door as a man approached the other side. "Yeah, he's got to be in here," the man yelled, almost in a cheerful way. He punched the door once, though it sounded heavy, as if he had hit it with a hammer, or maybe even a gun. I couldn't help but make a quiet gasp from the terror of it. The man let out a sick, chuckling laugh. Then the other man downstairs yelled something, and both of their footsteps faded away. I sat there with my gun held at the door for probably 15 minutes, with nothing but the sounds of winds blowing downstairs. Clearing the house carefully, I made sure they were gone, then put a small wooden board over the broken window to keep the snow out. The men had taken a few expensive things around the house and left a bit of a mess, but no other harm was done. The blizzard had settled by morning, and I informed my family and the police of the encounter. My brother was angry at himself for not having been there for me, but I assured him it was okay, and he made the right call to not drive in a snowstorm. Despite having the most horrifying encounter in my entire life, I actually had a really enjoyable Christmas with my family. People these days are cruel and awful humans, and to do something like that, to put someone through something like that, especially during the holiday season, is just another level of insanity. Story 2. Christmas was always a big event for my family. Every year, we'd drive out to my aunt and uncle's house, where I'd get to see all of my cousins as well as my grandparents. There's one year I still think about a lot, though, because something happened that I still can't get out of my head. I was only 10 at the time, and I was a relatively shy kid, so meeting new people wasn't enjoyable at all. This year, though, when we arrived at my uncle's house, my oldest cousin introduced all of us to her boyfriend, Drew. Apparently, they had been together for a few years, and things were getting pretty serious, so she wanted the whole family to get comfortable with him. From what I heard, they met at the college they both went to, which wasn't far, but Drew was from out of state, so my uncle offered him to stay at his house during winter break. Anyway, over the next couple of days, I remember avoiding him as much as possible. I really didn't want to talk to some stranger I didn't know, and I definitely didn't want him to act like he was my big brother. However, my younger brother, who was only 6, was talking to him all the time. It was like they had just become best friends in just 2 days. My parents thought it was cute that my little brother was looking up to him, but I found it to be weird. I don't know, something about it just made me feel uncomfortable. During the nights, I shared a room with my brother, and I'm assuming Drew and my cousin shared a room on the other side of the house. I asked my little brother, as we were getting ready for bed, why he liked Drew so much, and he just talked about how cool he was. I don't really know what I expected my 6-year-old brother to say, but when he responded, it's kind of clicked in my mind that I really should be wondering why Drew wanted to talk to my brother so much, not the other way around. I know this all sounds like it may just be taken into bad context, when it could just be a loving, soon-to-be cousin-in-law, but it was just a feeling in my gut that told me something was off. And just 4 days after we had arrived, and on the night of Christmas Eve, my gut feeling was proven to be right. I specifically remember going to bed that night, noticing my brother having a lot more energy, way more than he should have at that time of night. I thought it was because he was excited about Christmas morning, as I was too, and I went to sleep soon after. Some hours later, I woke up. I don't know what actually woke me up, as the house seemed silent, but I instantly noticed my brother was not in his bed. My eyes widened, and I looked all around the room, calling out his name in a whisper. I felt protective of my little brother, and I was really worried about him. I almost wanted to cry when I saw that his jacket was missing. We both had been hanging them up on the handles of the closet door, but his was gone. I grabbed mine and rushed downstairs. From the bottom of the steps was a hallway. On one side was the front door, and on the other was the back door. Looking at the back door, the screen door was closed, but the actual door was open. I remember being scared, but more than anything, I wanted to make sure my little brother was okay. So I walked outside. Out in the field behind the house, I could see two figures, one large and one small. They seemed to be walking away from the house, but it was dark and hard to tell. I walked a bit closer, then gathered the courage to yell my brother's name. Both figures stopped for a moment, and then the smaller one started running towards me. My baby brother ran into my arms. His eyes were watery. I looked back up, and the other figure was still standing in the field, looking in our direction. I led my brother back inside and up to our bedroom. I asked what had happened and what he was doing outside. All he would say was that he was scared of the dark, but Drew wanted to play a game. I didn't know what that meant, but I didn't care. Waking up a 6-year-old and leading them outside in the middle of the night was not okay. I kept my brother close for the rest of the holiday, but now I wish I had told someone about it. I was a shy kid that didn't want to be the center of any drama, and I didn't think anyone would believe me, so I kept my mouth shut about it. That was a horrible Christmas though, and I think about it a lot. I've asked my brother years later what that Drew guy was doing, but even now, he says he doesn't remember. He only remembers being scared. My cousin never brought him to any more gatherings, so I'm assuming things didn't work out. I'm glad I saved my brother from whatever was going to happen that night, but I think back to it a lot, wishing that I had done more. Story 3. Christmas for my family is probably similar to most other families. My wife and I tell our son that Santa brings presents on the night of Christmas Eve, and then on Christmas morning, we wake up our son and let him open the presents. It's a very typical Christmas. So, of course, on Christmas Eve, my kid wanted to make cookies for Santa, and we left out a small plate alongside a cup of milk before I sent him to bed. Then, after waiting an hour to make sure he was asleep, I began putting all of the gifts under the tree. Once I was finished piling them up, I went over to the small coffee table and took a few bites of the cookies to make it look like Santa came. Feeling satisfied with my work, I turned all the lights off and joined my wife in bed. The next morning, my wife woke our kid up, and he ran downstairs to open his presents. He was so excited, screaming that Santa came. I always loved seeing his reaction to the gifts, but it was over after about an hour. He went off to play with his new toys, and my wife and I started cleaning up the wrapping paper and boxes. But that's when I noticed the cookies. Well, the lack of cookies actually. They were all gone. We had put out a whole plate and I had only eaten one. Confused, I walked over to my wife and asked her about it, though I knew she was in bed the whole time. She laughed at me, making a joke as if I ate the entire plate. But her smile faded when she realized my concern. I went over to my son and asked him if he had some cookies this morning, but his response only frightened and confused me more. He said he saw Santa eat them last night. Of course, I asked him what he meant, to which he replied that he woke up in the middle of the night and saw someone eating the cookies. I acted calm in front of him, making sure not to give the big secret away, as he was only 6, but I was seriously worried now. By the looks of it, my wife was too. It's such a weird, silly situation. But in reality, it was also terrifying, knowing that someone was inside our home. I took a quick look around upstairs, then searched the main floor before going over to the basement. Honestly, I hadn't been in the basement for months. It was unfinished, small, and dirty. The year before, we had our washer and dryer moved from the basement to the ground level floor. Ever since, we had no reason to go down there, so we just left it as an empty storage room. Anyway, I opened the door and turned on the dim lights. I waited several seconds before going down, thinking that if someone was there, they would make themselves known. With no other noises, I descended into the basement. From my initial look, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. There were boxes and dust, just like it had been left. But looking closer, a stack of the boxes seemed strangely put together. It kind of reminded me of when I was a kid and would position boxes to make a fort or a wall. I took a few steps closer before I could hear heavy breathing from behind the wall of boxes. I froze in place, shocked and scared, hoping that whoever was there stayed hidden so I could peacefully go back upstairs and call the police. I was not so lucky, though. A disgusting, scrawny, middle-aged man stood up, looking me directly in the eyes. I was so shocked. I didn't even move. It wasn't until the man quickly began climbing over the boxes that I turned around and sprinted as fast as I could up the stairs. His footsteps were not far behind mine as I pushed through the doorway and slammed the door behind me. Seeing a glimpse of the man just a few steps down, I turned the lock and blocked the door with a nearby chair. My wife screamed and panicked at the chaos of the situation. She grabbed our son and ran upstairs while I stood by the door and called the police. Funny though, because my first thought while dialing 911 was how bad I felt for having to call someone on Christmas morning. Then again, my family's life was in danger. As I waited for the cops to show up, the man tried to persuade me to let him go and that he meant no harm. At one point, it even sounded like he was talking to himself. The guy sounded insane. I almost felt sorry for him. When the officer finally made it, he arrested the man with ease, and I filled out a report. We tried to not let this ruin the rest of Christmas, but it was difficult to get back into the joyful mood. It turned out he'd been squatting in our basement for anywhere between several days and a couple of weeks. He'd been taking some of our food and drinks while we were gone too, which just made me feel sick. Thinking back, I'd even remembered things missing. Stupid things like the last granola bar being gone, and everyone claiming it wasn't them. These are just normal things that you just chalk up to being anything other than someone living in your house and stealing your food. Now, I get a bad feeling in my gut every time something goes missing, as I remember that creepy guy staring at me and chasing me out of the basement. True stories about a winter night drive. I've been a taxi driver in the big city for over 16 years, specifically Chicago, but I used to live in Las Vegas and worked as a driver there as well. Recently, I know a lot of new methods of getting around have been coming up, like Uber, but this happened to me years ago before that even existed, or at least before it was commonly used. For context to those who aren't familiar, Chicago has cold, nasty winters, and the temperatures dropped to freezing all the time. The taxi service I worked for wasn't the typical yellow taxi car type job you used to see all the time. This, at the time, was a more modern type of job where you use your own car and put a sign on top whenever you're working so that people know that you're a taxi. In return, the company takes a portion of your earnings, but this way, you can work whatever shifts you want and can charge what you feel is necessary at the time. This felt like a luxury I never wanted to end. But it didn't last forever. I never set a schedule for myself, so I would just go out and drive whenever I decided on any given day. During the holidays, I worked more hours though, since more people are out and about. I didn't have any family nearby at the time, and I lived alone, so holidays were just like any other day for me. This unfortunate event took place on Christmas Eve. I began driving at 10 a.m. and was very pleased with the amount of business I was getting. There was almost no downtime between customers, and they were willing to pay more due to how busy it was, which meant I was making nearly $80 an hour, which was really good for me. By the time 8 o'clock came, I had been working 10 hours, but was still making great money. However, snow started falling. It was light still, but I figured I still had time before it got worse. I took a quick stop at a fast food place to grab a bite to eat, then headed back out to work as much as possible while I could. The crowds were dying down, but a lot of other taxi drivers had gone home as well, which meant I had less competition. I picked up a small group from a large road and took them home. They lived in a relatively low-quality neighborhood with very close together old homes. The group was nice though, and left a good tip. As I was pulling away from the side of the road though, a man came from behind a parked car and held his hand out as if wanting a ride. It was hard to see him through the snow and darkness, but he had a dark hoodie on, and as I got closer, he almost looked nervous. But honestly, this wasn't uncommon around here. I pulled up next to him, and he got inside. "Foreign?" I asked, continuing forward. Again, as I rolled down the street for a few seconds though, I realized he still hadn't answered. I spoke again, more punctual this time, asking where he needed me to take him. I looked in the rearview mirror as I asked, and the man made eye contact for a second before looking away. Then he spoke. Just take me here," he said, pulling a small piece of ripped paper from his hoodie pocket and handing it to me. On the paper was a poorly written address on a street I was unfamiliar with. Having driven in the city for years, I'd at least heard of almost all the road and street names. So, this made me pretty confused. My initial thought was that it may be a far drive outside the city, and in that case, I wasn't sure if I could do it. At an empty stop sign, I reached over to my rarely used GPS and typed in the address. Nothing came up. I started to get nervous, looking back at the paper and GPS to make sure I typed it in right. Sir, I don't know where this address is," I said as I turned my body to face his. "Yeah, just pull over here," he said in a surprisingly strict tone. I was pretty sure what was happening, but I remained calm and pulled over on the side of the road. This street was pretty much empty. No cars, no people, no lights. I put the car in park and just sat there, looking forward. The man turned around for a second, looking out the side window, then immediately lunged his body between the front seats and grabbed my head, pressing a small gun to it. He was screaming things at me, asking for my wallet and keys and everything, but I was in so much shock, and all I could focus on was the pain due to how the man was aggressively digging the barrel of his gun into my skull. This only angered the man further, and he continued yelling as I tried to grab my wallet. But I guess I wasn't fast enough. He pistol whipped me in the back of the head, making my vision blurry and sending a rush of pain through my head, as if I suddenly had the worst headache imaginable. Dazed and barely conscious, I tossed my wallet on the passenger seat. I don't even know what I did wrong this time, but he hit me again, worsening everything. I'm assuming the man noticed my condition though, as he took the opportunity to get out of the car. But that was the last thing I remembered. I woke up on the side of the street what seemed like just a few minutes after the attack. I was covered in snow and was freezing. My car was gone as well as my wallet, keys, and phone. My head was killing me, and I could barely manage to walk. Shivering and in pain, I made my way through the snow-covered sidewalks to a nearby gas station and got help. In short, my car was found a week later further outside the city, abandoned on the side of the road. Thankfully, I had no lasting injuries, but getting a new phone, license, bank card, everything was just a hassle. Without my car, I couldn't work either. The whole thing was just awful, not to mention the terror I felt in the moment. What really bothers me was how aggressive the guy was for no reason. I mean, if the guy just asked me for my stuff, I would have given him no trouble. I just don't understand why it had to go down the way it did. Clearly, his goal wasn't to kill me, so why did he have to hurt me so badly if I was complying? Since then, I started working for a larger taxi company run by the city where they give you a car and everything. It makes me feel safer, but I still find myself getting uneasy around certain people. Luckily, I can choose to not work nights though, and on holidays, I make sure to be much more careful because I found out the hard way that just because it's Christmas doesn't mean all the horrible people take the day off too. Story 2. I was on the road during a small snowstorm and had been driving for about 8 or 9 hours already. I say small snowstorm because it was much more snow than a regular snowfall, but not as much as a typical blizzard you'd probably imagine of a normal snowstorm. I was delivering a few pallets to a warehouse for the company I worked for, but I was ahead on time, so I didn't feel any need to go quickly, especially not with the snowfall. I was on a dimly lit highway and had my brights on when I could see in the distance a flashing and flickering light getting closer. I realized it was much larger and brighter. It was a deep red, and that's when I realized it was a fire. The snow falling down made it too difficult to tell if it was on the highway or off to the side, but either way, I was gaining on it fast. I tried to brake slowly, but I had completely misjudged how close I was, so I pressed down harder, feeling the back trailer starting to slide behind me, and I immediately let go of the brakes, causing it to straighten, but jolt back and shake the whole truck. It was terrifying trying to keep the truck from tipping over and not slide into the fire. Closing in on it though, I realized it was off the side of the road, and while it was a relatively large flame, it seemed to be centered in a single spot. I was able to get the truck to stop safely on the side of the highway. As I leaned over and looked out the passenger window at the tree line next to the road, I could barely make out a small car at the center of the flames. I was in awe at the sight, never having seen anything like it. I quickly undid my seatbelt and got out to see if anyone was hurt, staying a safe distance away. I tried to look around the scene for anyone. I didn't know how it could have caught on fire, and the car seemed pretty normal aside from the burn marks. It kind of looked like a regular parked car, not damaged or anything from any sort of crash. Not seeing anyone nearby though, I feared the worst, that someone may be inside the car. I pulled my phone out and called the police. I was thankful to have enough service to get a hold of them, but they were 20 minutes out, and firefighters and ambulances were even further out. The more I stood there in the cold waiting for the police, looking at this huge flame coming from what seemed like any other car, I started wondering if it was intentional. Now I'm no detective, but it just didn't look like an accident in any way. My body shook at the thought, and I turned around to get back to my truck. "Hey, hold up!" A man called out from beside me, maybe 35 feet away, but was masked by the falling snow. I looked in that direction, my heart starting to race, as two men walked up to me. They were wearing face masks covering their mouth and nose. I greeted them and asked if they knew about what happened here, and they both shook their heads, which was really odd considering I didn't see or hear them pull up in any car. There was no way they walked here in the middle of nowhere on a highway. So I obviously started getting a really bad feeling in my gut. I said, beginning to walk, "Try not to seem afraid," one of the men said strictly. I turned back around, and in that moment, I faced the most terrifying thing in my life. The man had a handgun pointed right at me. I told him I would comply with whatever he wanted, and then he told me to move and stand against the trailer. He aggressively patted me down, taking my wallet and phone, while the other man robbed whatever he could find in the front of the truck. I was trying to hold in tears as I was thinking about my family and how this might be it for me. I was almost sure that they had lit that car on fire now, meaning they likely robbed someone just like me, and I didn't see anyone else around, so we all know what that probably meant. After a minute, the second man reproached us. He put his hand on the man's shoulder who was holding the gun and leaned in, whispering something in his ear. Then, just like they came, they both rushed into the dark, disappearing through the thick snow. I was in shock, still standing against the truck, before running inside and locking the doors. I didn't have my phone or wallet, so I just stayed and waited for the police to arrive. This whole thing was a big deal in the area for a while. Though it happened many years ago, the car was set on fire by the two men. And unfortunately, I was right. They robbed an old lady who was pulled over and burned the car to make sure no evidence of them was left. They were caught not long after, eventually giving details on where the body was. But they never gave an explanation to why they went back to the scene when they saw me. It could have been to rob me just as they had done, but it seemed like a big risk for little reward. Most of all, I don't know why they chose to let me live considering what they had just done to the previous victim. I am grateful though, and I hope nobody else has to go through something like that. My advice is that if you see something, just stay in your car, lock the doors, and call the police. Don't go trying to help because there's always a chance that it's going to end up being you who needs help. Story 3. I was a normal pizza delivery driver for Domino's in high school. I also worked part-time at a Jimmy John's on the weekends, but that was just a side job. Anyway, I just wanted to put that out there so that, I'm not just some random guy doing his first delivery. I was very familiar with making food deliveries. And what happened on this night was not normal at all. 90% of the time, I don't take the phone calls. Usually there's someone in the restaurant that takes the orders and gets the pizza ready. Then I just run inside, grab it, and go. This time was no different. I just finished with a previous order and ran inside the shop to pick up the next order. As I grabbed it though, my coworker told me to make sure the guy pays him full. It was an obvious statement, so the fact that he felt the need to say that was weird. I was in a rush because of the snowy roads though, so I just said, okay. As I walked out, getting in my car and situating myself, I thought about it a bit more, and then actually wondered why he said that. I settled on the idea that it was probably just some upright guy that was trying to get discounts. I began the drive, and if I remember correctly, it was just 10 minutes away from the shop. I should mention it was just past 10 p.m., so the roads were mostly empty, but as soon as I pulled out of the parking lot, I noticed a car speeding up behind me until he got close. Then he eased off and matched my speed. I couldn't tell what type of car it was, but it isn't uncommon for people around here to go crazy fast at night when no one else is on the roads. That being said, the snow was falling a good amount, so going fast probably wasn't the best idea. I kept my speed and just casually drove, hoping he'd just go around me or turn off somewhere, but he stayed. It wasn't until we reached a traffic light that the person pulled into the lane next to mine. I always just stare ahead at traffic lights so that I don't make awkward eye contact, but someone started yelling from the car next to me. I looked over, seeing a man staring right at me with his window rolled down. I quickly broke eye contact and looked forward again, but the guy started yelling again, asking me to roll the window down. I pretended not to hear him and started fiddling with the pizza bag next to me as if I were searching through it. I kept the traffic lights in the corner of my eye though, and as soon as it turned green, I quickly sped down the road. The man didn't stop though. He continued next to me, driving erratically and swerving all around. His window was still down, and I could see he was constantly trying to stare at me and get my attention. The man looked angry though, so there was no way I was stopping to talk to this guy. But I was getting really annoyed. I wasn't even scared, just bothered by this guy. I wanted to take a side road or something to try and lose him, but the snowy conditions made me question whether or not the side roads would be plowed yet. I was not in the mood to get stuck in the snow with this crazy dude, so I just took my chances and stayed on the main road. Only 1 to 2 minutes away from the house, the guy still beside me sped up and immediately swerved into my lane in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, but it only slowed my car slightly before it began to slide. Luckily for me, the other guy had the same problem. His car continued sliding all the way off the road and into the thick snow. His car had almost completely turned 180 degrees too. My adrenaline was making me shake as I rolled down the road slowly, looking in my mirrors at the guy's car. I then picked up some more speed so I could put some distance between us, though I didn't think he'd be able to get out of there for a while anyway. I felt bad for leaving him like that, but he clearly had bad intentions, and I was not going to stay there to find out what they were. I pulled into the driveway of the customer's home and walked up to the front door, knocking several times. After a minute of no answer, I called my boss, who then called back the number to tell them I was there, still knocking and ringing the doorbell. My boss called me a minute later to tell me that he didn't pick up. I stood there confused, looking at the lights that were left on in the house. Then I started to put the pieces together. I ran back to my car and drove out of the neighborhood. I took a different route to the shop just to make sure I avoided that car, then told my boss what had happened. I believe the customer was the guy in the car. My boss said he gave him a bad feeling on the phone, making him think that he wasn't going to pay. I think the guy's plan was to follow me out of the shop, then get me to pull over so he could rob me, either of the pizza, my wallet, or both. It made sense that the man wasn't at home too because he had gotten stuck in the snow. I don't know for sure, I could just be overthinking all of it. But my boss agreed with my theory. He said he would notify the police and give them the guy's number and address, although he never updated me about it, so I'm not even sure if he actually did. But as far as we know, that guy hasn't called the shop since. Creepy, true Airbnb horror stories. I owned an Airbnb house for several years. I stopped due to the stress of keeping up with it, as well as maintaining my actual job. The benefits of using Airbnb instead of renting the place out like you normally would is that you would have the chance to make a lot more money if your house gets booked a lot. Being in a relatively high traffic area for vacations, Airbnb was a great option for us. My wife and I were excited in the beginning, but it got more demanding as more people booked the house. We needed to keep everything on schedule and hire cleaning services after the first customers left and before the next ones came, as well as be sure to respond to their messages and emails in a timely manner. But things were going well for a couple years before we had what we thought was a young couple staying at the house. Just like every other time, when they arrived, I texted them the unlock code for the door. I almost never actually see the customers after they let me know that they were inside and everything was good. I sat back and relaxed for the rest of my day off. I should also mention that I almost never even talk to the customers, more than just a couple texts. Usually they text me when they get there and when they leave, and sometimes an occasional question about the house, but that's usually it. But as 9 o'clock came around, and I was just about to get ready for bed, I got a text from the young man staying at the house. It was short, saying he was going to call me in a minute, and then a minute later, he called. I already had a bad feeling when I saw the text, but what he said still surprised me. He said that the water wasn't working in the house. Of course, I apologized, though I didn't understand how that could be possible. But living in a house without water is unacceptable, so I knew I had to get it fixed immediately. I asked if I could come check it out really quick so that I could have someone come in the morning to fix it. He agreed, being very polite about the whole thing, and I drove over there a few minutes later. Pulling into the driveway, I noticed 2 cars. At the time, this wasn't necessarily a red flag, but more just an odd thing I noticed because they were apparently a young couple on vacation for a single night. So I didn't understand why they would rent 2 separate cars. I thought someone must be visiting them, which actually isn't allowed, but I didn't mind so much. I walked up to the front door and knocked before entering the code and walking inside. It was very quiet. I expected them to be waiting for me, but they weren't anywhere that I could see. I probably should have looked around for them first, but I was tired and just wanted to get this over with. The first thing I wanted to check was the main water valve to make sure there wasn't a leak or a flood. So I went down to the basement and over to the valve. Everything seemed normal. No water anywhere or signs of damage. I was confused, but then I fiddled with the valve and immediately heard water start rushing again. I turned it more, realizing it had been completely shut off manually. I stayed in the basement for another minute, trying to understand why this was done, before I started to get a really uncomfortable feeling, especially since I didn't even see the people when I walked inside. I just couldn't see how it could have been anyone other than them who turned off the water, which meant they were trying to get me to come over on purpose, or maybe give them a discount on their stay for the inconvenience. I decided I was going to leave and get my car, then try calling them back just to be safe. I got up and started walking towards the stairs until I heard the basement door open, followed by multiple sets of footsteps walking down. When they got to the bottom, 3 men stood there. "Is it fixed?" one of them said, sounding like the same man I talked to on the phone, though all of these men were much older than the young man that I thought was staying at the house. I told him it should be working now, and that the valve must have just tightened on its own. I was trying not to point any blame since the whole thing was making me so uncomfortable. I just wanted to get out of that basement and away from these guys. They all just kind of stood there looking at me, not saying anything after that. "Well, let me know if you need anything else," I said, walking between them, trying to get to the stairs. They still just stood there watching me walk around them. But as I went past the 3rd guy closest to the stairs, I spotted a gun shoved in the back of his pants. It made me freak out a little, and I rushed a bit quicker up the stairs, but they didn't follow. They stayed in the basement as I quickly walked out the door and drove away. When I got home, I woke up my wife and told her what had happened. She convinced me to call the police to check up on them. They weren't the people we thought were staying there, and the situation was strange, so it felt justified. I think we waited 20 minutes before a call came from an officer claiming nobody seemed to be home and that he may need me to open the door. I gave him the code instead, and he called back another 20 minutes later saying that there were no signs of anyone still being there. The next day, we found out the card the man paid with was stolen, and after looking around the house, they had stolen some expensive decorations and appliances as well. I guess there never actually was a young couple either. The one thing that was left unexplained was their whole plan with the water not working. I think they either wanted me to not charge them for their stay, so that hopefully they could use the stolen card for longer, or they were planning on robbing me at gunpoint. But then that makes me question why they didn't. 3 dangerous unidentified men blocking my exit in the basement after leading me into a trap, and they just let me go. It doesn't make sense to me. But after that, I never went to the house while customers were home, and a few months later, we stopped using Airbnb and just put the house up for rent. Story 2. I was taking a solo trip to Salt Lake City last year. I'd never actually had the chance to go on many vacations before, and when I did, it was always with my family. This was the first time I was finally going to get to enjoy my time somewhere else all by myself. I know it sounds a bit weird, but being alone is fine with me, especially since I'd never get to be alone anyway. I looked up both hotels and Airbnbs in the area, and surprisingly, the Airbnbs were a lot nicer and less pricey. However, all the cheaper ones were a bit further away from the city. I was driving my own car though, so I didn't care too much about having to travel a bit to the city and went with a nicely sized Airbnb. It was small, but the kitchen and bedroom were nice, which was all I really cared about. I got there at 6 on Sunday morning. The owner texted me the password, and I brought all of my stuff inside. It was really nice, much better than the small apartment I shared with my roommate. Once I got everything inside and set up, I hopped on the couch and turned on the TV. It was a 10-hour drive, so I was looking forward to chilling for the night and enjoying the silence. I fell asleep pretty quickly, but it was only around 7 o'clock, so my body woke me up a few hours later. The time was just past 10, and the TV was still on. I grabbed the remote and turned it off, then got up to get a glass of water before going to the bedroom. As I walked from the living room to the kitchen, I felt a strong, cold breeze brush against me. With my tired eyes, I looked to my right and saw the front door was fully open. My eyes shot open and my heart pounded. I stared at the door for a moment, then looked around the room. I knew I had closed it and locked it, so this was really freaking me out. I walked over to the door and closed it softly, listening intently for any sounds of someone being inside. For reference, I'm not the biggest guy in the world, but I am fairly tall and in shape, so unless an intruder had a gun, I felt confident I could force them away. I grabbed a kitchen knife, still being quiet, and walked room to room, checking every inch of the house. Nobody was there. This only confused me more, and I sent a text to the homeowner asking if someone was supposed to come over tonight or something, explaining what happened. It was late though, so I didn't expect a response right away. I went around to every door, locking each one, then quickly checked the house again while more awake than I was before. I was still really tired. I went to bed and fell asleep with no trouble. When I woke up though, I was much less calm than I was before. I heard something from outside, not outside the house, but outside my bedroom door. I didn't know what to do and kind of just froze, waiting for whoever was outside the room to do something first. As I sat there in bed, I thought about how the person could have possibly gotten in. The only person who would have the password to the door was the homeowner, so honestly, in that moment, I was sure it was him. This gave me more courage, thinking it must be some creepy guy who likes to spy on the people who stay at his Airbnb. I got out of bed, still not having heard anything else, and grabbed my phone from the nightstand to call the cops. I must have made too much noise though, because almost right away, someone started running away from the door and toward the front of the house. That only frightened me more, knowing the intruder was standing right next to the bedroom door the entire time. I dialed 911, but during the time it took for the cops to arrive, nothing else happened. The person had left. I found a hotel to stay at for the rest of the vacation, but what's crazy is that the owner of the Airbnb gave me a refund as he was able to prove it wasn't him. He was very concerned about it, and he was actually a really nice old man. It was already creepy enough when I thought it was the owner, but knowing that it was just some random guy makes it even worse. I don't know how he was able to get in, or why he was stalking me, but it still gives me chills thinking about it. The part I think about the most is waking up and seeing the front door open. Now that I know that someone was actually in the house, that meant that whoever it was came in and saw me asleep on the couch, then proceeded to do whatever it was they came there to do. It's just really unnerving and creepy, and makes me never want to be at an Airbnb alone. Story 3. I was staying at a small 2-bedroom Airbnb during a vacation I took last year. This place was on the way to another Airbnb that I was going to stay at for the main portion of the vacation, but this was more of just a rest stop for the night. The place was clean and empty, just as expected when I arrived. I walked around the whole house to check it out before bringing in my luggage and sitting on the couch. It was probably 8 p.m. by this time of night. As I sat dozing off a little, the doorbell ringing made me jolt awake. I looked over at the front door, confused and alarmed. I was a pretty small young girl, So, it's safe to say I'm often scared easily and don't like talking to strangers, especially at night when I'm alone. I got up and walked over to the door, hearing two men whispering to each other on the other side. The door didn't have a safety lock or anything, so I just kept the door shut and called out to them. "Hello? Hey, we're here for the Airbnb. Can you open the door?" a man called out. I loudly asked what they meant, not understanding what being here for the Airbnb was supposed to mean. He responded, saying that he had the place booked for the night. I knew there had to be some sort of mistake, so I told him, still yelling through the door, that I had it booked as well, and that he needed to contact the owner. The man didn't seem happy about that, although if I were in his position, I'd be pretty upset too. I heard one pair of footsteps walk away from the door, while the other man asked again if I could open the door so that we could talk about it. I was about to give in, putting my hand on the doorknob, thinking that he seemed believable, but something came over me, telling me to just play it safe. I said my husband would be down to figure it out in a few minutes. I didn't want them to think I was alone, so I was hoping that would catch him off guard if something was bad. The man didn't respond though. I waited for another minute because I didn't hear any footsteps leaving. But then I moved the short curtain to the side and looked out the small window. The man I'd seemingly been talking to was facing towards his car parked in the driveway, and past him was one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen. A group of maybe 5 people was standing further down the driveway, kind of hiding as if waiting for a signal. They all had some form of face coverings, and I couldn't see the other side of the door, but I assumed that there were even more people over there. Knowing that this was very likely a gang due to the city I was staying in, I was completely horrified. I backed away from the door, fully panicked, and tried not to hyperventilate. I then went to the bedroom to get my phone and call the police, and I could hear more footsteps all around the house. It was like I was surrounded by a pack of wolves who at any minute could crush the windows and break inside. I took my phone into the bathroom with me and called 911, trying to remain calm. The operator also told me to be quiet and stay calm as they were sending a group my way. It would be there in just a few minutes. I stayed on the line, still hearing footsteps walking around outside the place, until the horrible sound of wood bending and then snapping came from the front door. I was crying profusely now, trying to muffle my mouth with my hand. I listened as a whole group of people ran inside, opening doors and cabinets before one approached the bathroom door and tried the handle. "Here!" he yelled, then walked away. The group continued looting the house before sirens were heard in the distance, and they began to scatter out of the place. They had all left by the time the police got inside, and all of my luggage was gone, and my car had its window shattered and was looted as well. One of the officers sat with me to discuss some details, and he informed me that they've been having problems with large groups or gangs breaking into homes recently. They don't think the main goal is to hurt the residents at all, but rather to just rob them of everything. So that's likely why they left me alone in the bathroom. Whether their intentions were to harm me or not, it was still terrifying. I know it likely had little to do with me staying at the Airbnb that night, but it has still made me really anxious every single time I stay at an Airbnb now.